Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Paris-aligned timelines for the phase-out of oil and gas production. My name is Iveta Gerasimchuk. I'm Director for Sustainable Energy with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I will be chairing this discussion today, and as people are joining, I'll just start with some housekeeping rules. Then I'll briefly introduce the topic of the webinar and our distinguished speakers. And I'll do a repeat of housekeeping rules because they're really important. So we have been delighted to have more than 300 participants registered for this webinar. We are absolutely overwhelmed by the interest in this topic and the new report. So we will keep you on mute just because there are so many people. But the Zoom technology allows us to have a vivid discussion, and we allow for ample time for this discussion in the second half of the webinar, for which you can use both the chat to share information, links, and things like this. But more specifically, for the questions to the panelists, please use the Q&A box. With that, I'm going to just say a couple of words why ISD thought this topic is extremely important and why we have commissioned this research. I think most people who have joined this webinar are aware of the pressing needs for addressing oil and gas supply as part of the efforts to meet the Paris Agreement's targets. And we are all aware of the need to cut with both arms of the scissors to address both supply and demand, and to cut both demand and supply for fossil fuels. But more specifically of the oil and gas discussion coming a little bit in the wake of the coal discussions and the progress on both science and policies with respect to coal phase out. So several years back, when the Paris Agreement was signed, there was a similar discussion about Paris-aligned timelines for coal phase out, speaking of both electricity generation and then, of course, also coal extraction. There was an influential report by the climate analytics team, which signaled such timelines for developed countries, 2030, and then for the rest of the world. And there was a similar kind of discussion, but on a lesser scale, started by academics for oil and gas. Again, you may be aware of research by Magleit and Eakins and their follow-up paper on what phase out of fossil fuels and oil and gas in particular would mean if we look at costs of extraction. But what we really want to discuss today, and what the new report is looking at, is what it means from the perspective of just transition, and taking into consideration that different countries have different capacity for oil and gas phase outs. The research has been led and performed by Professor Kevin Anderson and Dr. Dan Calverley. And we are delighted to have Professor Anderson as a speaker and presenter today. And later in the webinar, we will also have a discussant. This is Colin Bessens from PowerShift Africa. And at At the close of it, we will have a Q&A session. So we should be done in 1 hour. So I think most of you may know Professor Kevin Anderson by his previous research. He is Professor of Energy and Climate Change at 3 universities: University of Manchester, Uppsala University, and University of Bergen. He was formerly director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and his publications came in most influential, most important science journals, including Science and Nature. Kevin has a decade's industrial experience in the petrochemical industry and is a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. So with that, Kevin, the floor will be yours in a minute. So just for those who have just joined the webinar, I'm repeating that you will be on mute. You can already start asking questions to panelists, to Kevin, and later on to Colin in the Q&A box. But you can also use the chat if you want to share links or some information. And thank you for all your interest. With that, Professor Anderson, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm taking it you can all see the slides okay. Now, what I'm going to be doing is, I don't know, obviously, all of your different backgrounds, because with webinars, you never know who's going to join. So I've got quite a lot of sort of context setting and then sort of working the report into that. So to start off with, I'm laying a little bit of a sort of foundation, which I think is quite important to do. Now, this work was very much a collaboration between my colleague, Dan Calverley, and myself. Sadly, Dan's not with us today, so I'll have to answer the difficult questions. I've called it Time to Face the Music, Paris Compliant Phase Out Oil and Gas Production. Oops, just get it to change slides, there we go. But I'm going to start off in perhaps an unusual place, because I'm trying to set a bit context here. Just think about the banking crisis. For those of you that in your probably in your 30s anyway, you'll remember this. 2006, if you'd said then we need rapid social change or indeed technical change, the response would have been, that's impossible, the public will never accept it. We had the subprime mortgage the following year, triggering a banking crisis, which is pretty much a global banking crisis. We've had a decade or more of austerity policies building on that banking crisis and actually worryingly hitting the poorest communities again. Massive shifts in public services, job insecurity, huge social upheaval, and that is still going on, I think, in many of the wealthy parts of the world, particularly. With this massive shift in funding, quantitative easing, this transfer of public money into the private sector to stimulate spending. I'm not saying I recommend any of this. What I'm saying is overnight, we managed to find huge sums of money, absolutely huge sums of money, which beforehand you said, oh, we don't have that sort of finance available. So we went from the impossible to the delivered in 2 years. We then move on more recently to the awful COVID tragedy. 2019, again, if you'd said we want rapid social change, that's impossible, the public will never accept it. That's the sort of language we always heard from the policymakers and from many others. COVID comes along in 2019, 2020, triggers a global response, lockdowns, rapid mobilization of science and tech. Again, it's the poorer key workers in the UK, which I have obviously more experience of, typically people of colour, disproportionately impacted. Some real clear parallels with climate change here. But again, we went from the impossible to the delivered in 2 years. So in the past 1.5 decades, we have lived through 2 emergencies. And if you look at the COVID-induced emissions cuts, about 4 to 5% per annum, in the year for 2020. And if that carried on from now, year on year, that would give you an outside chance, not a good chance, an outside chance of around about 2 degrees centigrade of warming. So it gives you a flavour of the sorts of changes we're talking about. Are we learning lessons from what we saw there in terms of the rapid reduction in emissions? Well, again, the poorest and the wealthiest countries are seeking economic growth and trying to stimulate their economies, more energy, more oil, more gas, and ongoing coal. And I think it's really key to remember when people say we've got lots more renewables, the climate doesn't care about renewables or efficiency unless they displace fossil fuels. And that is definitely not happening so far. There is no timely decoupling at a system level from emissions. It's an appealing myth. That's all it is, yet it's regularly touted by policymakers. And indeed, I think far too many academics use that sort of loose language. Certainly economic is to be welcomed in the poorer parts of the world, but in the EU, in the USA, in the UK, there's a question to be asked, is enough ever enough? And if so, when? Or are we just going to have ongoing infinite growth in all of these things? So within the context of an emergency response, I think it's quite important to sort of lay out now a little bit of the science in a slightly flippant way, but not really. And the science does not respond to good intentions, Machiavellian policies, eloquent arguments, legal niceties, or accountancy scams. We've tried these for 30 years, and the physics has seen through them. Because at the end of the day, all of this is trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. It's the total amount of total quantity of CO2 and other greenhouse gases we dump in the atmosphere that relates to temperature and indeed to impacts. So if we think of that now in relation to our commitments, and going back to Paris here, where you'll all be familiar with this, so that we're going to reduce our emissions in line with well below 2 and ideally aim for 1.5 in accordance with science and of course equity as well. Not that we've taken any notice of the last of those in any way, shape or form. I'm going to focus here much more on the 1.5, and there's some reasoning behind that, because after Paris, we had the IPCC was asked to look into the impacts of 1.5. We had the really helpful 1.5 report, SR 1.5 in 2018, which I'm going to summarize really saying that the impacts of even 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming are severe across ecosystems, human systems, physical infrastructure and agriculture. More floods, more droughts, more extinctions, more human migration. So 1.5 is in no way, shape or form a safe threshold. The impacts of 2 are considerably worse, but I think it's worth bearing in mind, we are not trying to stay within the safe threshold anymore. People around the world are suffering from climate change today. It's not a threat, it's a daily reality for many people. But on the back of that, we had a whole suite of climate emergencies that have been declared by countries and companies, and all sorts of other people have declared these climate emergencies. Then in May of last year, there was the G7 communique, which strengthened this idea about trying to aim for being 1.5 below 1.5 or not exceeding 1.5. Then we had the COP, which had this keep 1.5 alive sort of strap line, and here we have the UK's government's chief scientific advisor saying keep 1.5 alive, and this is not negotiable. And I think it's certainly for many of the poor parts of the world, that is exactly what they say. It is not negotiable, and I'm taking that as a stance for this presentation, and indeed for much of our report. So the headline framing for our report against this backdrop was we wanted to be consistent with Paris, G7 and COP26. We want to align with the latest IPCC carbon budgets in Working Group 1. And we want to be informed by the UNFCCC's, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's concept of equity embedded in that really quite awkward term, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So they're the 3 sort of framings, if you like, of our work. And that last one, for those that you may not be familiar with that rather appalling acronym, basically it means that wealthy nations need to lead the way in eliminating CO2 emissions. And we've tried to water that down at every COP ever since 1992, but it still remains there, despite all the efforts by the wealthy countries to water it down. Our interpretation of Paris, G7 and COP is really that we want to aim for, we're using the language here of the IPCC, 67% chance of not exceeding 1.5. Let's convert it into a convenient language. A goodish chance of 1.5, a 50% chance of 1.5, an okay chance of 1.5, a 50% chance of 1.7, which broadly plays out as a good chance of not exceeding 2. So that's a more sort of understandable form of language than the typical stuff that we use as academics talking about these likelihoods and percentages and so forth. So we looked at all of these in the report, but we particularly focused on this, an okay chance of not exceeding 1.5, which is, in our view, probably just about what we could deliver. I mean, it's hugely challenging, as you'll see today, but even the 2 degrees centigrade one is. So what does the IPCC tell us about staying below 1.5, giving us a good chance or an okay chance of it? Well, if we look at the last 3 main reports, Assessment Report 5, SR 1.5, and Assessment Report 6 that just came out last year, summarizing all of those in terms of mitigation in one line, it's the total carbon budgets that matter, not some sort of long-term targets, not some net zero by 2045 or 2050 or whenever it might be. It's the total amount of CO2, principally CO2, but also the other greenhouse gases that we dump in the atmosphere that really matters in terms of temperature and therefore in terms of impacts. And for those of you who aren't familiar with carbon budgets, it's broadly the area under the curve. So if in the short term, we have more emissions because we've decided that in Canada, Norway, and the UK and the US, we want to produce more oil and coal, oil and gas, and other parts of the world, maybe more coal, then it means that we have to compensate for that in the future, which I'll demonstrate in a minute is impossible, in my view anyway. So if we now want to go from our commitments, our 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, really aiming more at 1.5, to these carbon budgets, if we take the latest of the IPCC reports, what we have is a table like this. Some of you may be familiar with it, others maybe not. And it tells us quite helpfully, as a very rough approximation, if we want a particular temperature that we're aiming at, 1.5 degrees C warmer than the pre-industrial period, which, as I say, is not a safe threshold, then from 2020, it tells us how much carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere for different chances of those temperatures. So you can see here 500 billion tons we can put in the atmosphere. If we want a better chance, it drops to 400. Or if we're prepared to go for 2 degrees centigrade and pass on a lot more impacts to our children, and of course much more impacts to poor parts of the world, then we have a larger carbon budget, but we have to suffer the consequences of that. But we're here, as I say today, focusing mostly on the 1.5, giving us a sort of an okay-ish chance of staying or not exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. We're at about 1.1 currently. But those numbers are for all carbon dioxide, regardless of where it comes from. And what we wanted to do here was to think about this really in terms of energy, because we're looking at fossil fuels. So given these chances we have of 1.5, we can then make an assessment based on the IPCC. So basically just the IPCC values with a few minor adjustments and bringing them up to date to 2022. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that we're now coming to the end of March in 2022, and that means we've dumped about another 8 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere in this year. So that's 260 billion tons we can have for a good chance of 1.5, goodish chance of 1.5, 360 billion tons for an okay chance, which is what we're focusing on, and that rises quite considerably if we want a good chance of not exceeding 2. To put some other sort of context into that, because these numbers may mean very little to some of you. The first of those is 7 years of current emissions. The one we're really looking at here is about 10 years of current emissions. And already we see this year, there's no sign of us trying to curtail our production of fossil fuels or indeed our consumption. And for 2 degrees centigrade, we have longer. This is of current emissions, of course, assuming we just carried on at the current level, but we probably won't do. Almost certainly our emissions will go up again this year. Now, if we put that into a plot, then here we have, I should say a good chance of 2 degrees centigrade there. That's a mistake there, sorry about that. So that tells us roughly what that pathway looks like from today. If we play it out for a goodish chance of 1.5, we look somewhere there. And if we look at the sort of okay chance, we see a plot there. Now, what you can tell from these, just look how steep they are. Look at the dates and look how steep they are. I mean, these are way beyond what we normally get to hear about when you hear policymakers, and indeed, in my view, far too many academics talking about 2050 and 2060 and still producing oil and gas and so forth, and indeed coal in some of the scenarios. I just think it does not fit in any way with what the basic science says and a little bit of arithmetic. So we're focusing here, as I say, on an okay chance of 1.5. So we have now a sort of a total budget for fossil fuels, and we want to focus even more so on oil and gas. But the first thing we have to do, therefore, is to think about coal. Now, I think it's important with coal to realize, well, firstly, it was, in my view, that coal, indeed the countries using coal, were unfairly bashed at the COP26. It was that usual story of how can the wealthy countries again beat the poor countries. So it was all this stuff to talk about coal to avoid attention being on oil and gas. Certainly coal is the most carbon intensive of the fuels, and we should be trying to phase it out first. But let's also be clear that coal is not traded globally anywhere near as much as oil and as gas is increasingly also now being traded on the world market. Coal is typically produced indigenous coal production in poorer countries and used by them as well. So use and production of coal in poorer countries. So when in COP26 we were beating coal, we were really, in a sense, again, using a stick on the poorer countries to draw attention away from what we're doing in the wealthy countries. So we had to play out the coal scenarios first, and we did quite a simple approach to that. We looked at these what we call developed and developing country parties, following the language of the Paris Agreement. And you can see here on this plot, for the 1.5 degrees centigrade carbon budgets we were using, you can see what we assumed here for coal. You can see the DG being the developing countries and the DD being the developed countries. And you can see this language we use, the FZY, functional 0 year. So it's when you get to almost zero, pretty much. And you can see there the two dates of 2030 and 2040. Just to put this in a simpler format, basically for developed countries, we need a 50% cut in our emissions of coal in 5 years and phase out by 2030. Developed countries, a 50% cut in 10 years and phase out by 2040. Both hugely challenging, particularly I think for the developing countries. But if you don't do this, then the budgets for oil and gas are slashed even further, making it much, much more challenging. There is no easy way out of being in 2022 with just a whisper of carbon budget remaining. That's the reality of our choice not to do anything on climate change for 30 years. So we're focusing in here on oil and gas. Now, there are 88 countries that produce oil and gas at any significant level. I think that's about 99.87% of all oil and gas production. So it's pretty much all the countries. And for various reasons, we didn't separate out oil and gas. There are some merits to separating them out, but I think there are also significant benefits from thinking of them together. Gas is lower carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour than oil, but oil has much greater flexibility than gas. Oil is more widespread in the poorer countries as well. Gas principally still is a fuel of the wealthier countries. That is changing, but it's still the case. And gas is significantly used for power generation, less so for things like transport. That again is changing very slowly. And there are lots of alternatives to power generation than using fossil fuels. Of all of the things to deal with from a technology point of view, moving away from fossil fuels for power generation is probably the easiest or the least difficult. So we felt it was appropriate to consider oil and gas together. And then we needed to divide the oil and gas carbon budgets between nations. And to do this, we wanted to find sort of what metric would we use when we think about the issues of fairness. As I say, right at the beginning, we wanted to take account of this language of the UNFCCC of common but differentiated responsibility. In other words, the richer countries have to move away from fossil fuels faster and eliminate them altogether ahead of the poorer countries. So we wanted to take that into account. And we did that. In the end, we tried lots of things that looking at this, what was the best way of doing it? There's no right way of doing this. There's some wrong ways, but there's no absolute right way. But this was what we felt most adequately captured it. And we looked at the GDP per capita of all the countries, took it as a purchasing power parity comparison because that made quite a big difference. And we excluded then the income from oil and gas. So we're effectively looking at the GDP per capita of all of the countries that produce oil and gas, and then imagine they didn't produce any. What would they have left? How big would their economy be left? And we use that as a proxy for capacity to make the transition from being an oil and gas producer to not having any oil and gas production, and therefore no revenue from it. Now, it's true to say, as is the case for a lot of these things, data is not particularly good. And as a result of that, what we decided to do was to group the nations. So we can't tell you exactly what the situation is for any particular nation. We can tell you which groups the nations are in, and we can give a good flavor of information for those countries. But we have to be careful about not overplaying the actual precision that we have, because the data isn't wonderful on this. So then in dividing the budget between countries, what we first did was we grandfathered the budget to every country, every group with these different countries in them. And grandfathering means basically we took the total carbon budget that we have left for oil and gas for all the countries of the world, out from now out to forever, and we split it out simply on the basis of what the current oil and gas production is for each country, and therefore the emissions from those if they were to be burned. And then we did quite a lot of what I think it's fair to call it this. It's always you can hide this in a black box model and put some algorithms in it. But actually, the reality is that we have to make judgments in this. There's no, again, there are wrong ways to do these things. There's no perfect right way to do them. And we use a sort of combination of judgment and iteration. It's quite a long process going backwards and forwards to think about how you do all of this, taking account of the issues of fairness we talked about before, and this measure of non-oil GDP per capita, looking at the current level of current emissions in terms of the production of oil and gas from the different countries, and the proportion of the GDP for each country. And that's really important. That comes from oil and gas revenue. So if you look at the UK, for instance, about 1% of our GDP comes from oil and gas revenue. So 99% of it is not. So if we closed our oil and gas down, taking care to the just transition for the workers, it wouldn't dramatically change our economy. The US about 8%, Norway 14%, Qatar 40%, Iraq, and actually quite a number of other poorer countries, a really key component of their economy. If you took that out of their economy, it would be a disaster. And so it gave us quite a good indicator here of how we should think about these things. As I say, it's a dynamic process with a mixture of maths, art, and narratives. And I think far too often in these scenario developments, we think it's all about some sort of simple science. It's not. There's a combination of judgments that go on, and the more open and transparent they can be, the better. And we try to make them very open and transparent in our report. We had 5 groups of all of the 8, looking at the 88 countries around the world, and this is the nice plot that's in the report, which hopefully, if you want to see, it's all online now, so you can get access to it. And you can see from the left to the right, the left groups being the wealthiest groups. So this is once we've removed the oil and gas revenue, how much GDP per capita is actually left for them. Now, if you look at the left-hand group, these typically are the much wealthier countries, but they also are the major producers. So 35% of global production is in that group. And even in group 2, which are still relatively wealthy countries, another 30%. So the majority of global production, 65%, is in these top 2 groups. And then you can look at the, as you go down, reducing GDP per capita for each country once you move the oil and gas revenue, and see some of the countries, I mean, they're very poor anyway. We move the oil and gas revenue and they're just basically bankrupt. And just to give some flavor of this, you can see these, picking out a few of the numbers here. Norway, $57,000 once you remove the oil and gas revenue, and the US is quite similar to that. If you went to the second group, Saudi Arabia at 25,000, so nowhere near the same degree of capacity as Norway. And there are some interesting things there in that 1 or 2 of the other countries, like Qatar, have diversified their economies much more than, say, Saudi Arabia has. Both produce lots of oil and gas, but significant differences in diversification. If you look at the poorest group here, second poorest group in group 4, you're talking about Iran at about $10,000 once you remove the oil and gas revenue. Remember, this is purchasing power parity, so we've taken that into account. And you've got Mozambique down the far end at $1,000, incredibly poor. In poor before you remove the oil and gas revenue, but even more if you move it afterwards. Though obviously at the moment, Mozambique's not producing a huge amount. Now, when we played all this out, what you end up with is a series of phase-out curves that you can see here. Again, these are all in the report, and you can look at these in detail if you want to. But to pull out the sort of headlines from this phase-out curves, it's the wealthiest group, and the wealthiest group include the USA, Qatar, Norway, and the UK, for instance. Then by 2030, they need to reduce their production by about 3/4, 74%, there or thereabouts. And zero production, in other words, close down all production by 2034, 12 years from now, 12 years. For the second group, which includes Kuwait, Saudi, and Russia, for instance, they have still to significantly reduce production by 2030, 43%, and then eliminate all production by 2039. For the third group, we're talking about, remember those top 2 groups are responsible for 68%, 65% of all production of oil and gas. The third group, 28% reduction by 2030, and that includes Mexico, China, and Colombia, and zero date by 2043. The fourth group, an 18% reduction by 2030 and zero production, so all cease all production by 2045. That's South Africa, Iran, Azerbaijan. And group 5, and I think it's important to note this, that for the 1.5 degree scenario, group 5 still, the poorest countries in the world, still have to cut production by 2030, but then they have out till 2050 to eliminate production. And that's Libya, Iraq, South Sudan, and quite a number of other countries who are incredibly poor. Oil is a major part of their economy, but actually of the global production, it's a very, very small proportion. So really sort of concluding what was a fairly challenging piece of work, I think it's fair to say. A huge amount went into it. A lot of data chasing, a lot of thinking about how to address issues of fairness in a way that was open and transparent and made sense. And the conclusions out of this, and I think I'll go back to the context first. Remember that the context is here. If we are to deliver on our commitments, we made the commitments. I assume that our leaders meant it at face value when they signed Paris, G7, and the Glasgow Climate Pact and so forth. So I assume that we mean that, and that we would deliver the sorts of reductions that are necessary. And so that's how this plays out now. The first thing is, though, I think that most of us, most of the policymakers, and indeed, I think many of the other people working on climate change, let alone the sort of wider civil society, really don't really grasp that the carbon budgets we have remaining are incredibly challenging, far more so than most of us are prepared to realize. And that's not helped, I think, by the way that these things are reported in the press when we repeatedly hear about 2045 and 2050 and even beyond then. You know, what we need to be hearing about is 2025 and 2026. This is the time frame we should be talking about. We're talking about the rapid and early phase out of coal by 2030 for the developed countries. And that doesn't mean you can wait till 2030. That means it has to be shut down by 2030 for production, and 2040 for developing countries, bearing in mind again that there's not a huge world trade there in coal. For the wealthy producers, and as I said before, that's typically the US, Norway, UK, and so forth. We need to cut our production by 3/4 by 2030 and phase out by 2034. Massively challenging, but that's the consequences, as I've said before, of now 31 or so years of since the first IPCC report of really doing nothing significant on climate change. So it's a consequence of what we have chosen not to do. For the poorest countries, though, it is still not an easy story. It's still a challenging mitigation agenda for them also. Cut by 14% by 2030 and phase out by 2050. What is another challenging thing for both the poorer parts of the world, but the wealthy countries, the higher producing wealthy countries, already think they can produce more fossil fuels. Well, if we are serious about our 1.5 commitment, you cannot produce any more fossil fuels. No oil, no coal, no gas, anywhere, just period. The other thing I think is really key is that however we played with the mitigation agenda, and we've found this in other work as well, you can no longer satisfy the equity criteria of common but differentiated responsibility. In other words, we have left it so late. I would add to that, those of us in the wealthy countries have deliberately left it so late that we can no longer cut our emissions fast enough to make that, to do that fairly. We are requiring cuts by the poorer parts of the world that are no longer fair. And so in addition to this difference in the phase out dates, which doesn't satisfy fully in any way the equity criteria, it makes a move in the right direction, but doesn't satisfy it fully. And therefore, to go along with that, we need really very significant financial transfers from the wealthy parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world. And for two reasons, I really suppose. One is because we've got to help the poor parts of the world deal with the impacts that we have chosen to impose on them, the climate impacts that they are already suffering in many parts of the world. We chose to do that, and therefore I think that we must help them deal with those impacts, but also to help them leapfrog over the fossil fuel area that has brought the wonders and the quality of life that we have in the global north. And we have benefited from that, and now we have asked the poor countries to not do what we did, and therefore we need to help them make that transition, that leapfrog over the fossil fuel era. So there are important financial transfers to consider as well. On that note, thanks for listening. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope it made some sort of sense of the report, which, as I say, is now online, so you can get to read it at your leisure.
Kevin, thank you very much for your very instructive and thought-provoking presentation. So it's a lot of ground covered in a very short presentation, and much more to dig and see in the report. There are already questions coming up. Just saying that you can also vote up other people's questions, and you can add yours. And while you're doing so, I'm going to give the floor to Colin Besans, who is with PowerShift Africa. So he is program manager for African energy transition, and his own research focused on renewable energy transitions and models for achieving an equitable global fossil fuel phase out. Colin, the floor is yours for a quick reaction to Kevin's presentation and the report more generally.
Thanks so much, Yvette, and thanks so much, Kevin, for the fantastic presentation. I know summarizing 70 odd pages of work and a long body of research in a few slides is a tough one. And yeah, as someone who's worked on the equity side of fossil fuel phase out from the qualitative perspective and the equity principles perspective, I think major respect for those who are willing to try and bite the bullet of quantifying these dates and putting numbers to things. Because I think we can all acknowledge that it's a really sticky question. You're never going to be able to have dates or models that account for every person's consideration, and that it leaves you open to a lot of misinterpretation, right? People can use those dates for their own narratives in ways that might twist the true nuance of the research. And so maybe just to give a brief reaction, as Iveta said, I work at PowerShift Africa, and so a lot of our work is focused on landing these phase-out discussions and really a broader energy economy transformation within Africa. And so part of the comments that I'll give briefly here are kind of to contextualize a lot of what this phase-out discussion and these dates mean within that grounded context. And I guess more broadly, some cautions to us as a broader movement for how we can ensure that this narrative lands in the right way. And so part of the report that I really just want to underscore, and that Kevin mentioned at the end in those conclusions, it's point 6 in the kind of headline messages. And forgive me for reading it directly, but I think it's really important to hear. So it says, from a mitigation perspective alone, it is no longer possible to deliver an equitable division of the small and rapidly shrinking carbon budgets. Although poorer countries have longer to phase out oil and gas production, many will be hit hard by the loss of revenue with an attendant risk of political instability. An equitable transition will require wealthy, high-emitting nations make substantial and ongoing financial transfers to poorer nations to facilitate their low-carbon development against a backdrop of dangerous and increasing climate impact. And so I guess the part that I really want to highlight here is that while the headline of the report and the research is about these dates, that doesn't mean that equity in terms of financial transfers can be a nice benefit on the side of that or an add-on at the end of the discussion. That equity in terms of financial transfers is a necessary part of the discussion. And anyone who seeks to, I guess, use the report to speak solely about the dates as a framework for equity without the concurrent financial transfers, I think would be doing a disservice to the fantastic work that has been done. And I think if we think more specifically about how it could be misused, in poorer countries where there's a lot of people wanting to exploit existing fossil fuel reserves, one could easily pick out the dates alone and say, well, look, we have until 2050 or 2045 to be reaching zero. And so, obviously there is room for new expansion, which is clearly not what the report says. But as soon as you're willing to give people a date, that's how folks can exploit or misrepresent that. And in richer countries, it's easy to say, well, look, we have these earlier phase out dates, and if we meet those, that's our equity burden met, right? If we're reducing by 2035, look, we're doing the equity thing and putting aside all of those financial transfers. And so I guess the main message I'm trying to give here is, if we really want equity to land out of this, the dates are such an important anchor for us to work around, but we have to be the ones to make sure that the rest of the discussion doesn't get left behind. Because if it's only about the dates, we'll see the existing powers that be and infrastructure completely abuse that. And so then the last point of reflection within this is, from all the panels and discussions that I've been on across different African regions about the transition in the last few months, I have been truly worried and maybe even disturbed by the extent to which gas as a transition fuel is a very prominent narrative that's coming through. The idea that fossil fuel phase out is really, a Western idea that's being pushed on Africa to kick away the ladder, to stop us from development, to hold us back, is unfortunately unfortunately becoming increasingly prominent. And I think the challenge that we need to take on is the reason that it's becoming prominent. And that's because there's some truth behind that, right? There are many examples where the West has indeed tried to kick away the ladder and hold us back. And I think denying that hypocrisy wouldn't serve us, but acknowledging that hypocrisy and saying, simply because people have been hypocritical in trying to tell us what to do, does not mean that we need to make the same mistakes they did. Doesn't mean that we need to go down the very slippery slope of fossil fuel expansion and further development. And really, it's the challenges on us to articulate that alternative vision for what could happen without fossil fuels. And so I think if we look at what we mean when we talk about phase out, we need to acknowledge that for many countries, they're not phasing out existing production. They're needing to avoid production that's about to take place. But we need a narrative that doesn't just say, well, there's support for those who are phasing out existing production, like South Africa securing its lovely $8.5 billion, but also some support for those who don't yet have production, but are going to need to avoid going down that slippery slope. So if Senegal is to stop exploiting the reserves that it's just uncovered, if Mozambique is to make sure that it doesn't go down that path and increase the production that might not even be on our existing phase out analyses, we're going to need a system that really takes seriously the idea that mitigation isn't just about reduced emissions, it's about avoiding emissions in the future. And our movement and our analyses really need to center those questions. And lastly, they really need to center energy access, because for hundreds of millions of Africans and many across the global South, the question is, I don't have any energy access. And so you're speaking to me about fossil fuel phase out. I wish I had some energy to go by, right? And if our narrative and our work doesn't acknowledge those really, really pressing needs, and our equity frameworks don't include that massive transfer that's needed to those folks, I think we'd be doing a massive disservice to the movement in general and to equity at its core. So that's to conclude my remarks. Thanks so much to Kevin for the fantastic research. And I really hope that we can all take this forward and ground it in the full nuance that it deserves and that is included in the report. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Colin, for your remarks, for being the discussant. It's really illuminating, and it's interesting to see how much the equity issues are now also discussed in the questions. So if you have questions for Colin, and I hope we will, please also post them and mark them as questions for Colin in the Q&A box. And right now, I'm going to read some of the questions and have Professor Anderson answer them. There is a group of questions about the methodology, and in particular, Kevin, you used non-oil GDP per capita as a proxy for countries' capacity. So there are several questions about why you use this indicator, and also why you excluded historical responsibility for emissions from your analysis.
Okay. As I said in the presentation, there's no perfect way to think about issues of equity here, but we had to find some way to say, how do we apportion out the remaining carbon budget that comes from the science that relates to our 1.5 commitment? How do we apportion that out with some element of fairness in there? And so of all of the metrics we could use, this seemed to us to be better than many of the others. Some people would say you could look at just GDP per capita, but what we're asking here is for countries to stop producing very rapidly, stop producing oil and gas. So if they were reliant on the oil and gas and had to stop producing it, then that would be a real problem for them. So we felt it was a fairer metric to look at the revenue that was remaining once they weren't using oil and gas. And given that even for the poorest countries, they're having to shut down their oil and gas to a degree, even by 2030, that we felt that was an appropriate way to think about these sets of issues. And as I say, there are other metrics you can use, but we went through quite a few, and this in the end seemed to us about the fairest of the sort of quantitative methods that you can easily pull out. Historical responsibility is absolutely key. The drawback from looking at it from a purely dates point of view, and some people have done this, is that if you do it from that point of view, the global north is an emissions debt. So it needs to stop producing now, turn the lights off, and we should have started probably 10 years ago doing that. Now, there's no way we can sell that here. It's not practical in any way, even in extreme circumstances, it's not. And so the compensation for that to a significant degree comes from the financial transfers. That we have to stop ours well ahead of the poor parts, and we need the financial transfers as well. And that to a degree deals with some of the historical legacy. But let's not pretend at the end of the day, you cannot bring back the lives that have already been lost from climate change caused by our ongoing choice to emit in the global north.
Thank you. Let's go to the other question, which is more technical on carbon budgets. So there is interest basically in the assumptions you've been using, and in particular on methane emissions and the mounting evidence for methane emissions being much more substantial. And I guess the question on permafrost is related. So what if our kind of assumptions about permafrost melting are not are not met, and things are much worse?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, this is my reading of the working group 1, the carbon budgets that are in there, that they are conservative, and they certainly could be much worse than much smaller budgets than the headline values that are used there. But I think that's right. I think what they've produced there is correct. But if you read through the rest of the literature, which is quite a challenge to do, but as a discerning user of them, you've got to be aware there are lots of other issues that mean the budgets could be a bit bigger, or indeed the budgets could be smaller. One of these, of course, is things like methane. So methane concentrations have gone up in the atmosphere, which we don't fully understand why that is. There could be a number of reasons why that is, one of which relates to fossil fuel methane, particularly from shale gas production. But then there are other ones to do with, could it be that as the tropics warm up, we're getting more methane from biogenic activity, and could actually the mechanism that removes the methane from the atmosphere get a little bit sort of saturated, if you like, so it's slightly slower in doing this. So methane is a big issue. And it is possible that could have an effect on the budgets. But let's also be clear, methane and carbon dioxide aren't substitutable, as a lot of people use them in this sort of global warming potential, because methane's got a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere. It doesn't accumulate in the atmosphere. So if methane levels stayed constant, you wouldn't get any additional warming from methane. You only get additional warming from methane if the concentrations keep going up in the atmosphere. So even if we keep emitting methane at the same level, they don't get a rise in temperature. So I think we have to really separate methane out from the other greenhouse gases. There still is a risk, though. We could see a significant rise in methane levels if things like we see some of the permafrost issues, which some people talk about, occurring. I think it's fair to say the consensus is that it won't be sufficient to severely affect the carbon budgets. And indeed, my understanding in the budgets from Working Group 1 is they make an assumption that methane emissions will come down, and methane concentrations will come down, and hence methane emissions must come down. My personal take on that is I think that's a bit overly optimistic, but nevertheless, it's, a collection of scientists have come to that judgment, and I would probably come to a slightly different one. And so they're assuming the emissions will come down, which means the budgets are as the ones we see today. If the emissions don't come down, the budgets would be a little bit smaller. So methane is important. I don't think it's a game changer, unlikely to be a game changer. It could be, but I think that's unlikely, but it could have some impact. But we have to look at we have to look at rapidly reducing our emissions of methane from the agricultural processes that we have, and indeed from the fossil fuel industry. It is important to get methane emissions down.
Thank you. So there are more questions, unfortunately, than I think we can handle within the remaining time. I'm going to ask the next question to both Kevin and Colin. And there are a lot of points here made on less developed countries, and in particular also new producers who have just discovered oil and gas and trying to build up infrastructure. I think the report itself is very clear that no new infrastructure should be added. But then what you do specifically with these countries which are foregoing development opportunities as a result?
I think, Colin, if you want to lead on that one.
Yeah, happy to jump in. I think, some of the questions in the chat were getting quite specific on, what are the financing budgets available for Africa to abandon fossil fuels, and what are the energy needs? And unfortunately, I guess I'm not aware of research that has fully quantified what the true financial need is for an African energy transition. But I can guarantee you that it's a hell of a lot more than the 100 billion per year that is promised and consistently under-delivered, and is definitely in the trillions. And so I guess we're left kind of between a rock and a hard place, because I think this work and in general the budgets are pretty clear that even though there's room for slower phase out dates in Africa and other poorer countries, there's no room for new expansion. That's simply, we need to be bending that curve down as soon as possible. Otherwise, it just gets exponentially steeper and steeper what we need to do, and it becomes impossible. But on the other side, we also know that financing is simply not being made available on any significant or massive scale for African countries to make that transition. And so regardless of what the true need is, we know for a fact that we are so far away from reaching it. And so unfortunately, we're left in the bleak situation where we know that either outcome is unequitable, because if Africa forgoes any fossil fuel development, as I think many who are on the climate side of things hope that they do, but don't receive the financing necessary on a massive scale for transition, then they will be left without energy access, without development, and in a really tough position. And on the other hand, if we do a lot of fossil fuel expansion across Africa in the hopes of achieving some of that development, despite the fact that most of it never really trickles down as is promised, then we're in the other position of a world that warms past 1.5 degrees, where Africa is again going to be the hardest hit by that. And so I think what we need to acknowledge is that we've reached a situation where true equity is no longer possible, and it's about really fighting for the least bad outcome possible. And in my view, I really hope that that is a mass mobilization of trillions of dollars toward the global south to fund new infrastructure, new economies, new development. Whether or not I can truly tell you that I believe that's going to happen, I wish I could.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be quite careful talking about, particularly about Africa. I'm a typical white colonial from the UK, so my views are probably quite naive. But on the 100 billion, it's a crumb that fell off the rich person's table. I don't think we should be arguing about 100 billion. It's almost an irrelevance, even if it was met. And the real skill, of course, is to get us to argue about the crumb, and not talk about the trillions that are required, and in my view are owed through reparation. As for the structural side, I think every dollar that is spent on building new fossil fuel facilities is a dollar that cannot be spent on an alternative energy system. And I'm saying system there because I don't think I think you should again leapfrog the West and think that the energy system is an energy supply system. The services that energy provides us is a combination of what we do on the demand side and the supply side. And actually, you have an opportunity in some of these countries to start to think more in a more systems way from the beginning, rather than just sort of, just going down the supply route that we've been dominated by in the global north. So I think you have to think differently about what do you mean by the energy system and how do you spend those dollars appropriately. But locking yourself into high carbon fossil fuel futures, which are volatile prices, as we're clearly seeing at the moment, are expensive to build and very expensive to run, have local air pollution issues. And the price of renewables is absolutely plummeting at the moment. So it seems to me that even as we are today, renewables are often much, much cheaper than fossil fuels. Of course, they're not being pushed by the same companies. There isn't as much money that can be made by a small number of these companies. But the renewables, to me, sort of, it seems almost like a very obvious thing to be doing because they're cheaper and cleaner. They're easy to put in place. You don't require huge grid infrastructures necessarily with them. They can be more distributed. There are lots of merits to them. And certainly better than this sort of nonsense about transition fuel of methane, which is not of natural gas. Just to say, always think about transition. When people talk about transition fuel, or gas being a transition fuel, its chemical equation is CH4, and that means if you just do the quick bit of chemistry there, 75% of methane is carbon. So it's not a low carbon fuel; it's 75% carbon. So when people tell us it's a transition fuel, transition to something that's 75% carbon. That's barely a transition fuel.
Thank you. There is also a lot of appetite in the Q&A box for specific recommendations, be it policies or examples from countries on how you end fossil fuel production in practice. So maybe I'll let both Colin and Kevin come up with top 3 examples or recommendations, and I'm going to help you with the first one because we saw last year the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. So, for example, what members of this alliance can do collectively or individual level, or what have they done already that can be replicated in the rest of the world?
I mean, from a policy perspective, I really would not want to step outside the areas that I know, which is basically the UK, Europe, and the sort of some of the global north. So if we're talking about the wealthy parts of the world, and as I said before, I mean, they dominate the production of oil and gas anyway. So if I bring it home to the UK, and that's principally Scotland, but not just Scotland, because there's gas elsewhere as well, 1% of our GDP. So it's not a huge percent of our GDP. It has a reasonable number of people working in those sectors. If we park the corporate side, which I think are part of the problem, if you think of the engineering expertise, that engineering expertise is required to make the rapid transition to a renewable, low energy demand infrastructure. So it's not as if we aren't short of the job. So I think the bit we have to open up there is that discussion about, it's not as if you just close something down. What you're opening up is this huge prospect for the many of the people who work in the industry, because there's going to be huge engineering challenges on the renewables, the electrification, on the demand side, on the retrofitting our houses, putting in public transport. So it's a great jobs agenda for the people who work in these sectors, because often it's the sort of expertise they have that we need in making these physical changes to our infrastructure. But we've got to get that narrative out there. And so I think if we can get that narrative out there, it's less of an issue, because I think certainly for someone like the UK, and I know that's true for some of the other countries as well, there's a concern about the workers in the industry, rightly. I mean, we were terrible with how we dealt with the miners, and there's a legacy there. We still think we're going to treat the oil industry workers like that as well. So we have to think, what is the mechanism that moves them across from drilling for oil to putting in the foundations for wind turbines? If we think that through and do that practically, I think we could quite rapidly move away from renewables, from oil and gas rather, in somewhere like the UK and some of the other wealthier countries. I think the arguments in the US and Canada are much more locked into the politics than the sort of practicalities, perhaps in some places like the UK and arguably Norway.
Thank you, Kevin. So Colin, we're running out of time already, but Kevin, you have maybe 2 minutes before we wrap up.
Sorry,
Colin, I'm sorry.
Oh,
yeah, Colin.
No worries. Yeah, I guess just very briefly, I wish I could point to a whole bunch of examples of things that are working really, really well. And if I keep it Africa focused, you know, the South Africa 8.5 billion deal was the first time we've seen any, I won't say significant amount, I'll say any amount really mobilized towards transitioning an energy economy, but 8.5 billion is a really small amount if you look at what actually has to happen to transform, you know, a 60 million person economy. And B, you know, South Africa is probably the one that was most able and primed to attract any investment in the first place, because it has a really attractive system where you can cut a bunch of emissions from coal. And it's got a lot of integrated systems with the global economy. But, you know, if you start looking further north and you get to countries that don't have that internationally linked economy and don't have emissions that are appealing to reduce, no one is looking at pouring any significant amounts into their energy economies. And so I think that's the challenge for us as Africans, and the challenge we're working on at PowerShift is, can we build the compelling vision that brings people in rather than waiting for you know, donation or crumbs, as Kevin puts them? Can we chart an alternative energy economy that really does move away from the existing systems and the slippery slope? And I think, you know, if anyone's keen to join us on that journey, get in touch. But we're hoping we can chart the better future that will bring other people in, because waiting for finance and the North to deliver clearly is not working.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we have much less time than we need to answer all the questions that showed in the Q&A box. I just want to thank Professor Kevin Anderson and Colin Besans for their presentations today, and just generally to congratulate Kevin and his colleague Dan Calverley on the report. The slides and the recording of this webinar will be shared with all the participants. You will receive an email, and you can also look at the paper. The link has been also shared within the chat box. So we hope that this piece of analysis and this conversation today was useful, and we look forward to the continuation of this discussion among all participants, and ISD as a host today will be happy to continue this dialogue. Thank you very much, and again, wishing everyone a productive continuation of this discussion and action on the ground. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.